I will be touching on a variety of potentially sensitive topics such as religiously motivated bigotry, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and nationalism, bullying, anti-Semitism, sexism, homophobia, genocide, and being between the ages of 10 to 14. 8 days after I was born, I had a Brit Milah, the Jewish ritual circumcision ceremony. Some weeks after that, I was baptized in a Catholic church. My mom, a Catholic, and my dad, a Jew, wanted to raise me interfaith, with both religions being a foundational part of my upbringing. My family was not very religious. My mom was more religious than my dad, and even then, she was just a don't say the Lord's name in vain type. The only religious holidays we really celebrated at home were Hanukkah, Christmas, Easter, and Passover. My paternal grandparents would send my younger brother and I 8 gifts for each of the 8 nights of Hanukkah, and we would mess around with dreidels and light the Hanukkah candles. My maternal grandparents would come over to celebrate a typical American Christmas of Santa slipping through the cracked open apartment window and leaving presents under the tree. On Easter, my parents would help my brother and I paint eggs, and they would be hidden around the house for us to find before we went to Mass. On Passover, we would have a Seder at our home or at my grandparents' house and relate the story of the Jews in Egypt while eating matzah with horseradish and haroset, ending the night with a search for a special version of the afikomen my mom made, a piece of chocolate toffee-covered matzah we called matzah crack after its addictive properties. Besides Christmas Eve and Easter, my family never went to religious services unless it was a wedding or a funeral. We didn't go to Mass on Sundays, and we didn't practice Shabbat from sundown on Friday to sundown on Saturday. However, my parents still decided it would be best to raise their kids with a dedicated interfaith upbringing, such that we could grow up to be both Jewish and Catholic and embrace both sides of our religious identities as compatible and equal. To that end, every other week my family would go to an interfaith Sunday school. My parents would listen to some speakers talk about what I assumed was a variety of topics, including how to make this whole interfaith thing work. While us kids would be up in the classroom doing word searches and discussing Bible stories and eating snacks and comparing Judaism and Christianity. Pre-K only lasts for so long. My family needed to find a school to send me to. According to my parents, the local public school was not very good and had some violence or bullying problems. This led to my parents searching for a private school to send me to, and after a flurry of rejections, they finally decided to send me to a K-8 conservative Jewish day school that did accept me. I don't remember too much of the days of junior kindergarten. I remember I spent the first half of the day at a kindercare before getting shuttled over to the Jewish school for the second half of the day. I remember fighting and getting bitten by another kid at the Jewish school. I remember one morning at kindercare, we were using glitter or sprinkles or some kind of colored powder thing for who knows what, and I would mention the name of the colors. Adom, Kahol, Yarok. My parents tell me that while I was in junior kindergarten, a teacher scolded me for daring to mention Santa Claus at a Jewish school. Recently, I found a little artifact from my junior kindergarten days in my family's junk drawer, a wooden keychain with a heart glued onto a cutout map of Israel. In senior kindergarten, I left kindercare for good and now spent my full school day at the Jewish school. It was fun, as kindergarten should be. Before class, we would stay in an art room and make things. I specifically recall making this red-painted cross necklace for my mom that fortunately went uncriticized. We had a play where we dressed up as planets to explore the solar system. To help teach reading and spelling, they had a day where we dressed up as the letter people and described words that went with our letters. We learned how to write, too, tracing our aleph, bets, and gimels in large squares on worksheets. I learned how to spell my Hebrew name, Shin, Lamed, Mem, Hey, Shlomo. The teachers arranged the kindergarten seats in rows in front of a projector and had us pretend we were on an airplane flying around the world. First we visited Tokyo, then we visited Jerusalem. We were told that one day, when we were older, we would get to visit Jerusalem in real life. Every Friday, we would eat a lunch of challah, grape juice, and some other kind of dish. During lunch, us boys always had to be wearing our kippot. We would light 2 candles, pour the juice, and take the challah, each with their own respective prayer. My classmates and I would go to the water fountain on the outside of the classroom in order to dilute our grape juice and turn it from purple to pink. On Sukkot, we would spend a day around the sukkah making arts and crafts to decorate the walls with. On Purim, we would dress up in costumes and eat candy and hamantashen. And on Yom HaAtzmaut, the school would be decorated with blue and white streamers, and we would eat delicious Israeli chocolate in celebration of the Independence Day of the only Jewish state on earth. Sometimes, over the weekend, I would go to visit my maternal grandparents. Once I ran them through a Shabbat dinner, telling them the prayers and all the little things we would do in kindergarten. At home, I would laugh at my dad's ability to point out every Jewish musician who showed up on whatever music TV channel he was listening to. That guy, Jewish. That guy, Jewish. Everyone in this band except for that guy, Jewish. The summer may have been an escape from the Interfaith Sunday school and my Jewish school, but I still went to a Jewish summer day camp. Many of my classmates were there as well. We would run around and play games, eat bagels with cream cheese, and occasionally do other activities like writing wishes and prayers on little sheets of paper that supposedly were going to be sent to the Western Wall in Jerusalem. We were like 5 or 6 years old at this point, so my campmates and I opted to wish for Pokemon to be real and the occasional world peace entry. As I went through the rest of my years of lower school, 1st grade through 4th grade, I settled into the childhood I was given. In science classes, we made poster board projects for our own experiments using the scientific method. In math, we learned about basic geometry, multiplication, and division. My Hebrew classes grew more extensive, and I learned how to read and write Hebrew in cursive. Of course, learning Hebrew was a bit difficult, as most of the lower school teachers were Russian Israeli immigrants who did not speak much English. Jewish studies classes involved the reading and discussion of stories from the Torah, something I was already doing for other stories in Sunday school. Of course, we never talked about Jesus at this school. It was all Abraham and Sarah, Yitzhak and Rivka, Yaakov and Esau, and who could forget Mr. Donkey Jawbone himself, Shimshon. In our reading and writing workshop class, we read books like Hatchet and Number the Stars, which was my introduction to the Holocaust. Genocide was never a foreign concept to us, even if we didn't have the word for it. The story of Passover starts with the enslaved Israelites being ordered to drown all newborn males in the Nile. The story of Hanukkah involves the outlawing of Judaism and the attempted cultural destruction of Jewish life by Greek occupiers. The story of Purim has Haman, who basically amounts to Persian Hitler. Those are some of the most fun holidays in Judaism and are the reason that people joke that Jewish holidays are frequently, "Hey, remember when those guys tried to kill us? Let's eat." But they also highlight a core part of Jewish history and beliefs, that through God, strength, and wit, the Jews can and will manage to survive and escape their frequent and much stronger enemies. Jewish holidays happen frequently. There was always one right around the corner. Whether it was learning how to shake the lulav for Sukkot, or spinning gregers around at the sound of Haman's name for Purim, or making latkes with classmates, or having a school seder for Pesach, or throwing bread into the lake for Tashlich, or eating apples with honey for Rosh Hashanah, there was always something. They could be fun, boring, or a day off from school if you're lucky. Some years, the entire months of September and October seem to have no school at all because of the sheer frequency of Jewish holidays. To this day, I've still basically never done anything for Yom Kippur, despite it being the holiest day in Judaism, because school was off that day and my family never practiced anything. Yom HaAtzmaut remained the same as kindergarten, a massive school-wide celebration of Israel and Jewish culture, complete with traditional Jewish dancing, music, and Israeli and Jewish foods. We also still had our yearly winter concert, where every grade would perform a different song or piece of usually Hanukkah-related music. For the kindergartners, this involved a bunch of cute little kids spinning around and falling over to I Have a Little Dreidel, and for the older kids, it was usually something a bit more impressive. But every year, the concert would end with everyone singing Lee Greenwood's God Bless the USA.
That I'm proud to be an American, where at least I know I'm free.
Israeli nationalism was not the only type of nationalism the school peddled, and the American mythos was still a regular part of my upbringing, as in thousands of other schools across the country. At home, there was a disconnect with the religious environment of the school. I would go from a strictly kosher environment to my dad and I chowing down on bacon cheeseburgers. My summer camps were no longer Jewish ones, but instead became secular day camps and coding camps. I would shove my kippah in my pocket after I no longer needed it, and, forgetting it was there, I would take it home with me and add it to the constantly growing pile of kippot I stole from the school synagogue. Still, my Catholic education continued, and soon enough I would have my first communion with the rest of my Sunday school class at a small chapel above a soup kitchen. I was making friends at school, and the teachers tended to like me despite some of my behavioral issues. When those came to my parents' attention around the 3rd grade, they took me to a psychiatrist where I got diagnosed with ADHD. By the time I was in the 4th grade, the psychiatrist and my family had discussed options, and they decided that medication was not the best way for me to go. Instead, I went on a gluten-free diet, a diet I would keep for the next 7 or 8 years, and for whatever reason, it worked. By the end of it all, I was ready to move out of lower school and onto the more complicated, dangerous, and angsty world of middle school. Middle school had more interesting classes and subjects, better teachers, more Judaism and Israel stuff, a shifting social dynamic, and many more interesting excursions. The classrooms were larger and filled with a variety of books they didn't have in 4th grade classes, like the Hunger Games. We learned about history from ancient Mesopotamia to the Egyptians, to the Greeks, to the Romans, to medieval Europe, to the Renaissance, to the Enlightenment, to the American Revolution. We learned about different forms of government. We learned about different Abrahamic religions and took a field trip to a couple churches and a mosque. I showed off my knowledge of Christianity by reciting the Our Father, something I was taught in Sunday school. We learned about grids and graphs. We had a new lunch every Friday, Shabbat lunch, where we would sit at tables with kids from all other middle school grade levels and go through what basically amounted to a Shabbat meal service. On Yom HaAtzmaut, our regular festivities were interspersed with talks given by active Israeli Defense Forces soldiers. They would talk about their experiences in training and the dire need for Israel to be defended as it was surrounded on all sides by enemies. They also set up a crawl course in our gym, so that was kind of fun, if not a bit creepy. The U.S. military will often do similar things in American high schools as part of a recruitment effort, but I think it's a lot less common for a military from a country 10,000 kilometers away that most of us have never even been to do the same thing to a bunch of 11-year-olds. Our Hebrew and Jewish studies teachers, now at least more fluent in English, would tell us how fast they needed to line up in the IDF when we weren't lining up and shutting up fast enough for some activity. My brother has mentioned one of his teachers telling the class about their patrols through the occupied West Bank. Israel has an extensive mandatory conscription system, with most Israelis having served in the IDF at some point. Our teachers, particularly our Hebrew and Jewish studies ones, were often Israeli. If I had to guess, I would say about a quarter to a third of my teachers at that school were Israeli and thus likely former IDF. Every week during a homeroom-style class that would take place in the adjacent synagogue, we would end the class by facing the American flag, hands over hearts, and reciting the Pledge of Allegiance. After that, we would pivot to the Israeli flag and recite Hatikva, the national anthem of Israel, declaring the urge for a Jewish soul to be free in the land of Zion and Jerusalem. Our hours spent focused on Hebrew and Jewish studies also increased to about an hour and a half every day. On Fridays, we also had tefillah, or Jewish prayers. Our entire grade would be seated in a small room, surrounded and watched by our teachers, and we would pray in Hebrew, sitting, standing, with Sidurim not even being necessary because we had memorized every prayer we would do. Assuming 180 days of school instruction a year and 4 years of middle school, I went through approximately 1,080 hours of Hebrew and Jewish studies instruction in middle school alone, or 45 full days within 4 years. There were some moments that I still treasure I was able to have because of the school's Jewish nature, namely that I've met so many Holocaust survivors over the years. While my own family's Jewish side largely left Europe before the 1920s, many of my classmates had grandparents and great-grandparents who either survived the Holocaust or didn't. It has been almost 80 years, and among Jewish communities the wounds still cut deep, families still alive or in recent memory witness to some of the most unspeakable horrors in history. I've had the opportunity to sit with them and speak with them multiple times. That is something that increasingly fewer generations and fewer people will get the chance to experience, and I'm glad that I did. Socially, by middle school, I began to become more isolated with a smaller group of close friends. Out of a class size of about 50 people, I had a friend group with about 7 people. We played Magic the Gathering during lunch, were obsessed with Minecraft and other video games, and during recess we ran around playing zombie tag on the playground, usually only used by the lower school. And the Gaga pit. I fucking loved Gaga. While now I know these things were fairly normal for a kid my age, I was still considered weird by most of my peers. During parent-teacher conferences, the teachers would tell my parents that I needed to speak up more, despite the fact that I was doing fine academically. Despite my ADHD, most of my assignments were easy enough for me to coast by and get an A in. My parents would have me take an elective course on note-taking in an attempt to get me in the habit of looking busy and having study material for when I moved on to harder content. It didn't work. My dad used to joke that our family was poor. I didn't know it was a joke. I knew there were people worse off than us, in poverty or sleeping on the street, but I didn't think that we were particularly wealthy. Both of my parents had 6-figure jobs. By the time my mom decided to become stay-at-home when I was around 8 or so, my dad was making multiple hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. Tuition at the Jewish school back in the early 2010s cost about $25,000 a year, and they were paying that for both my brother and I every single year. However, relative to the rest of my class, we were a poorer family. Whether through work or generational wealth, many of my peers were more wealthy than I was by far, and many of those same people were those I had grown to dislike. Non-physical bullying against me became commonplace, and I started to push back too. I wasn't very athletic, wasn't as social, and didn't really mesh well with most other people in my grade. There would be jokes against me, dares. People called me weird to my face. The school administration knew about the issue. I talked about it with them to no avail. And by the time I returned from the office to the classroom, my classmates were writing a hurtful message about me I don't even remember today on the whiteboard, causing me to go back to administration. It didn't stop. And so the cliquey divide between my group of friends and the rest of the school continued to expand, and I grew resentful of a number of my other classmates. While a portion of that separation and resentfulness I now feel is at least partially my fault, and there are many things I regret, the preteen and teenage angst that often comes naturally is something that can be hard to avoid, and I was certainly justified in not liking many of my classmates for some other reasons too. For example, every year in middle school we would go on a Shabbaton. The teachers would load us into a bus and we'd be taken to some snow-covered summer camp in the middle of nowhere. There we would spend the weekend sledding, walking on frozen lakes, and playing hide and seek. But this also took place during Shabbat. This meant that we would also be subject to longer Shabbat tefillah sessions, Torah readings, and tons of other annoying Jew stuff. One night, around half our class met outside, without the knowledge of the teachers. One of my friends, we'll call him D, goes out to investigate. When he comes back, D says they're auctioning off the girls in her class. Whatever happened was confirmed the next day, when one of the teachers gathered all the boys into a room and scolded us for it. Around this time was also the onset of this wonderful little thing called puberty. In the 5th grade, they split the boys and girls into separate classrooms for a class on puberty. I'm not quite sure what was discussed on the girls' side, and if it was at all problematic. After all, little old Shlomo didn't know she was a girl yet. I do distinctly remember the teachers making us shout out any name we could think of for a penis so we wouldn't giggle when it was mentioned in class. Puberty sucks, especially if you're transgender. While I did start experimenting with my gender through means like cross-dressing in secret at this point, I still did not know basically anything about queerness or LGBTQ issues. While I was not exposed to homophobia or transphobia beyond the influence of gender roles by my peers, I did not really have any positive representation of LGBTQ people either. In 6th grade literature class, we were reading a book called The Misfits by James Howe. In the book, the single gay character Joe has a tendency to dress femininely and gets bullied through having the word faggot scrawled on his locker. In a hushed voice, our teacher said that we should never use that word, and falsely asserted that it was used against gay people because it means bundle of sticks in reference to burning at the stake. Joe never even got a boyfriend in that story. He was just an effeminate guy who got called slurs. That was the only representation there was for LGBTQ people like me. Naturally, through a combination of the gender roles already set on me, my lack of education, and the lack of representation around me, I denied that myself or anyone I knew was like Joe. The school also took it upon itself to try and remove toxic masculinity and sexism from our generation through education. This resulted in me being placed in a room every week with all the other boys in my grade and being told how to be men. By this I mean they showed us that men do not necessarily need to have masculine interests, and that it is okay to show emotions and cry. Yes, that is a better message than most of what you'd expect from a small weekly meeting on manhood from a religious school, and yes, it also fell on a bunch of 13-year-old deaf ears. At least I got the validation that even if I liked playing Minecraft, I was still a man. And I was supposed to be thankful for it. After all, the morning blessings say, "Blessed are you, Lord our God, King of the universe, who has not made me a woman." Taking a break from early teenage angst and religious school troubles, I would like to give a quick summary of some Jewish theology and history to be used in future reference. Disclaimer, I'm not a historian, and this is based on what I know and some Wikipedia rabbit holes. There are plenty of details that will be missing or potentially incorrect, but if you don't know much about Jewish history, hopefully this explains some. About 3,300 years ago, Moses was said to take the Jews out of slavery in Egypt. They walked through the wilderness for 40 years before arriving at the Promised Land, which was given to the Israelites by a burning bush, aka God. Moses got to see the Promised Land, but died before entering it as punishment for hitting a rock. The Promised Land was a place called Canaan, and because the Israelites were the people chosen by God to live in that land, they invaded city after city, essentially genociding the native population. It was their right, after all. God was on their side. Then begins the period of the Kingdom of Judea, ruled over by the kings Saul, David, and Solomon, and the construction of the first temple, blah blah blah, the Neo-Babylonian conquest of Jerusalem, and the Babylonian exile. More realistically, the Jews most likely emerged from a Canaanite tribe, and there was virtually no historical evidence supporting Israelite slavery in Egypt. The land was likely conquered over time or something. I don't know, and I don't care enough about ancient history and the legitimacy of biblical accounts. I don't even know if the Babylonian exile happened or not. I've explained the biblical narrative. Let's move on. The Persians conquer the area and let the Jews back in, and the second temple is constructed, and I think Purim happens. Then the Greeks invade, Maccabees revolt, and then there's Hanukkah. Then the Romans take over, Jesus makes an appearance, and there's a few Jewish-Roman wars. Those wars, the destruction of the Second Temple, and an assumed expulsion of Jews from Judea by the Romans, are often said to be the primary causes of the Jewish diaspora, although it is also argued that a large Jewish diaspora existed before this. Either way, the Kingdom of Judea and the lands which religiously, culturally, and ethnically linked the Jewish people were destroyed. The land, which was called a variety of things since then, but that I'll refer to here as Palestine, ends up being swapped between the Byzantine Empire, various caliphates, the Crusaders, the Mamluks, the Ottomans, and finally the British Empire with Mandatory Palestine in 1917. Meanwhile, the Jews have been spreading around the world, but as an ethno-religious group that often forbids conversions, the group remains rather small in the face of Christianity and Islam. The Talmud, the central text behind Rabbinic Judaism and Jewish law, has been written at this point. Various Jewish ethnic subgroups form, such as the Ashkenazim of Central and Eastern Europe, the Sephardim of Iberia and North Africa, the Mizrahim of the Middle East, North Africa, and Central Asia, Beta Yisrael of Ethiopia, and even the Kaifeng Jews of Hunan, China. These groups have a shared religion and shared culture which values the concept of Palestine as the land promised for the Jews with the eventual Jewish return to the land. But many differences emerge as well. The groups gradually integrate with their surrounding communities, but often never completely. Their cuisine and culture changes based on the people and places and things around them, and the groups begin to differ by language, by culture, and even religiously in some cases. Things tend to suck, and the Jews aren't really in charge of their own destiny no matter where they go. In Europe, they're kicked around and exploited from country to country, often by Christians who blame the death of Jesus on the Jews. In many Muslim regions, they're treated as second-class citizens and often put through a humiliating process when paying jizya. Many anti-Semitic tropes about Jews, such as the blood libel, are created and spread. Nevertheless, the Jews persisted and occasionally thrived off of taking the role of moneylenders, an occupation considered sinful by Christians. The focus on studying religious works in Jewish communities promoted literacy, something that was scarce in the medieval ages. After almost 2,000 years of all this, a Jewish correspondent for a Viennese newspaper observing the Dreyfus Affair in France decides that all of this is bullshit and that the Jewish diaspora would never be able to assimilate into society due to anti-Semitism. Theodor Herzl, the founder of modern political Zionism, writes the pamphlet Der Judenstaat, arguing for the creation of a Jewish state by means of purchasing land in and moving to Palestine, the region that Jews around the world still have ethnic, cultural, and religious ties to. It's these ties that are the reason Jews are considered a nation, regardless of where or when they are and if a Jewish country exists in the world. Hebrew, a language previously used only for religious purposes among the diaspora, is revived from the dead and reused as a common language, the only language to have done so in history. Theodor Herzl and the Zionist Congress end up trying to appeal to foreign nations in order to get support for a Jewish state. In 1917, the Balfour Declaration was issued by the British, now the controllers of Palestine, declaring support for the creation of a Jewish state. There is a common misconception about Zionism that its main ideological support was religious in nature, and that it was based around a return to the God-given Promised Land. However, early Zionist movements under Herzl featured a religious schism where Orthodox and Reformed Jewish branches separated themselves from the movement, and instead socialist Zionism became the dominant force. Gradually, there were waves of aliyahs, Jewish immigration to Palestine, and the establishment of Jewish communities and communes called kibbutzim. Zionist paramilitary groups such as the Haganah also start forming to defend Jewish settlements from Arab attacks, which start happening with increasing intensity. Support for Zionism skyrockets during the Holocaust as many Jews see their people killed by the millions, while nations such as Britain and the United States put in place immigration quotas. There are even reports of Czech Jews collectively singing Hatikva, the poem that would later become the Israeli national anthem, in front of the entrance to the Auschwitz-Birkenau gas chamber. Jews leaving the concentration camps, their homes stolen, looted, or destroyed by the war or their neighbors, often chose to go to Palestine. The Holocaust is often referred to by Jews as the Shoah, a Hebrew word meaning catastrophe. Conflict between Arabs and Jews in the region grows. Eventually, the United Nations says, "Hey guys, can we just split this place up and call it a day?" Most of the Zionists accepted the partition plan, just wanting an internationally recognized Jewish state. Most of the Arab groups rejected the plan, seeing it as a violation of their right to self-determination and a colonialist land grab. A civil war breaks out. The British leave. Around 900,000 Jews in Muslim countries began migrating or fleeing to Israel, and around 700,000 Palestinian Arabs flee or are expelled by Zionist militias. The Palestinian exodus and loss of land is often referred to by Arabs as the Nakba, an Arabic word meaning catastrophe. Israel declares independence, the Haganah becomes the Israeli Defense Forces, more radical Zionist groups like the Irgun are integrated into the IDF, and the 1948 Arab-Israeli War breaks out. Israel beats back every surrounding Arab nation that attacks them, captures more land than was allotted to them by the UN treaty, and ends the war 10 months later as the only Jewish state in the world after almost 2,000 years. Eventually, rising tensions between Israel and the surrounding Arab nations lead to the Six-Day War, where Israel ends up occupying Sinai, the West Bank, and the Golan Heights. Then there's the Yom Kippur War, where once again Arab nations banded together to attack Israel, this time on the holiest day in Judaism, only to be repelled. The Camp David Accords happen. Oslo Accords happen. Yitzhak Rabin is assassinated by an Israeli ultranationalist. Israel is creating Jewish settlements in Palestinian land that has been occupied since the Six-Day War. Israel leaves the Gaza Strip in 2005. Israel continues to create settlements in the West Bank. Rockets are fired into Israel regularly. Raids are conducted on Palestine regularly. Water, electricity, airstrikes, white phosphorus, rocket launchers near schools, shootings on streets. And then, 10,000 kilometers away, while I was in the 6th grade, someone hops the walls to my school and graffitis "Jews rape, Jews murder, rape and kill Jews, save Palestine" on our school wall. As far as I'm aware, they were never caught. My school was Israeli nationalist for sure. The maps in the classroom showed Israel with little distinction between Israeli and Palestinian territories. Even that wooden keychain I mentioned earlier shows the complete land as Israel, including the Gaza Strip, West Bank, and Golan Heights. But this wasn't just an attack against Israeli nationalists. It was an attack against Jews, and Jewish grade schoolers who had mostly never been to Israel at that. That was the first experience many of those in my grade had of Palestine, at least the first one that was more than an afterthought, and it cemented the idea that hate against Israel often led to hate against Jews, and hate against Jews often led to hate against Israel. No matter how far away from that land you were, the connection was inescapable. By the time of the 7th grade, I considered myself a Catholic, just as I considered myself a Jew. While I was certainly closer with the Jewish side of things, I had education from Sunday school and stories my mom would occasionally share with me to inform me of tales from the New Testament side of things. But the more anti-Christian elements of the Jewish school remained. The media we watched in Jewish studies frequently featured overtly Christian villains targeting Jews. During Tefillah, one of the Jewish Studies Department staff, who was known for telling stories, would mention how Christians are much more religious than Jews are. Me, currently sitting in Tefillah for the 100th time rather than Mass, openly refuted him. He would later go on to tell the story of a Jewish man who wanted to marry a Catholic woman, but alas, an interfaith marriage just couldn't be. But wait, it turns out the Catholic woman actually practices Judaism because she's a descendant of some conversos who continued to practice Judaism in secret to escape the Inquisition, and she was just too stupid to know that that was Judaism and not actually related to Christianity in the slightest. Now that the two were both Jewish, they could marry and live happily ever after. I was understandably super pissed and exclaimed that my parents were happy together, which they were. I was considerably getting more and more angry with the Jewish Studies Department in Judaism. A single meme page pushed me over the edge. By this point, I had my own laptop that I had saved up to purchase for myself a couple years ago. This meant that I had access to the internet and had been browsing around for a bit, mainly on Minecraft forums. Eventually, I ran into a website dedicated to atheism memes, and I got sucked in. My entire life I had been told that I was Jewish Catholic, both. My whole life I was told that people would tell me to pick a side between the two, but that I could hold firm and declare myself to be both. I knew about Islam and a vague bit about Buddhism from the religion unit in the 6th grade, but those barely served as a blip in my mind. For as far as I was concerned until then, everyone was Jewish, Catholic, or both. It did not occur to me that neither was an option too. Reading these meme refutations of God and the Bible, primarily oriented at Christianity, shitposts and infographics about how religion is a scam and God isn't real, massive graphs charting out inconsistencies in the Bible, I was hooked, and within a couple weeks I was convinced. I was never really religious, and I don't think I ever really believed in God with all my heart. It was just the world around me that made me go through the motions of religion, and here I got affirmation that those motions were, in fact, pointless. I shared it around my friend group, and most ended up agreeing. God is dead, religion is fucked, why am I still wearing this stupid hat? A couple weeks later, I sat down with my dad at night and told him that I no longer believed in God. He said that was okay, and I broke down crying for a good while. The next morning, it was brought up in the car while my mom was driving my brother and I to school. She said, "I really wish you weren't." She denies saying that to this day, but I pretty distinctly remember it happening. Later, during a Christmas Eve Mass, they're doing communion. My dad pushes me off the pew and tells me to go up, despite my protests. When I return, I'm tearing up. My dad asks me what's wrong, and I tell him I didn't want to go. He apologizes. Along with their reactions to my transition years later, another case of my mom doing this passive-aggressive resistance she conveniently forgets about, and my dad being clueless. I hated Mass, I hated Tefillah, I hated Kippot, I hated dressing up in nicer clothes, I hated pretending to pray, I hated being surrounded from all sides with these beliefs that I no longer believed in being pushed on me. I was preparing for my bat mitzvah. My parental grandparents had brought me a talit from Jerusalem, and my maternal grandparents had brought me a hand-carved wooden yad. I was to read a Torah portion, make some commentary about it, do some prayers, etc., and then I would be considered an adult under Judaism, fully responsible for following Jewish law, or halakha.
Like that's ever gonna happen.
My Torah portion, assigned based on when the actual service was in relation to the yearly reading of the Torah, was about Jacob wrestling the angel. If you don't know that story, there's this guy Jacob, and he wrestles an angel. They're pretty evenly matched and wrestle all night until the sun starts coming up, but Jacob's brother Esau is coming to attack him with an army of 400 men in the morning, so the angel has to skedaddle. The angel touches Jacob's hip, dislocating it, but Jacob keeps hanging on to the angel anyways, saying he won't let go until the angel gives him a blessing. The angel is like, "Fine, dude, you're called Israel now because you wrestled with God. Are you happy?" And then they lived happily ever after. Fortunately or unfortunately, when the actual bat mitzvah came, I ended my Devar Torah talking about how that story is why eating meat from the hip socket isn't kosher, instead of going on some tirade about how I've wrestled with God too. The bat mitzvah itself was pretty nice. Unlike the others I went to, which mostly took several hours in a synagogue, my service was located in a small chapel above a soup kitchen. The rabbi was a woman with dyed hair and probably some pronouns lying around someplace, who actually interacted with the audience during the service instead of making it the most boring thing humanly possible. She was easily the best rabbi I've ever met, and the whole thing only lasted like an hour. Hallelujah. The fact that it only lasted an hour is a big deal because I had the bar and bat mitzvot of about 49 other classmates to attend. There was a service and a party every weekend. Depending on the denomination of the person having the service, there would be a different synagogue and a different length. Of course, this is all very boring, and there were so many services that I would typically go to the bathroom and hang out someplace else until the service was almost over. My parents scolded me, saying this was disrespectful to my classmates, and it probably was. But the alternative was sitting around in the same rooms over and over again for hours, trying to keep my ADHD ass occupied while some rabbi or cantor droned on about something I didn't care about in Hebrew for hours. The main Reform synagogue was a large building with a main room surrounded by a hallway on all sides. These were among the most common services, typically lasting around 2 hours or so, and I usually spent them hanging around this water fountain in the hallway my friends and I dubbed the Holy Water Fountain that had some absurd water pressure that made it always blast the wall when you turned it on. Many of the conservative services lasted around 3 to 4 hours, but they also typically took place at the synagogue attached to our school. We would spend the service hanging out in the coat room, exploring the empty school, and watching random people sneak back into the service 10 minutes before it ended so they could get a free lunch at the after-service buffet. There were a few Orthodox services as well, which lasted around 5 to 6 hours. The seating was gender segregated, splitting my friend group, and there wasn't much to explore. It sucked hard. Also, if it was a bat mitzvah, then the actual bat mitzvah girl wasn't allowed to carry the Torah around because apparently women aren't allowed in Orthodox Judaism or something. I don't know. After the services were the parties, where I sat around in a corner with my friends drinking sodas for 5 hours and talking about random bullshit or napping until my parents could pick me up. If there was anything that cemented my distaste for the Jewish religion, it was that circuit of dozens of B'nai Mitzvot. When the summer between 7th and 8th grade came, I went to my paternal grandparents' house. We watched the news there. Operation Protective Edge was happening. We watched rockets fly from Gaza and get intercepted by the Iron Dome. We saw Israeli airstrikes hit Gaza. My grandparents argued that Hamas put their rocket artillery next to schools and hospitals so that Israel could not destroy them without sparking international outrage. My grandma said that they should just nuke Gaza. I told her that that was a terrible idea. That was a quick, relatively damn sensible comment. It was also the first time I really spoke in defense of Palestine rather than just ignoring it all for years, even after the graffiti incident. The bombings we watched on TV were landing in crowded cities. Sure, they were trying to stop Hamas from firing more rockets willy-nilly into Israeli cities, but there were a lot of Palestinian civilians dying to the various strikes. And for the first real time, my little Jewish heart felt an actual sense of empathy for the people that were either ignored or demonized as Arab invaders set on killing Jews by my family in school. As someone who had been surrounded by Israeli nationalism since about the time I could read, that was some big character development. The 8th grade approached. It was my final year at the school and the year my class would finally go on Tiyul, our annual 8th grade trip to Israel. By this time, my atheism had more time to develop, and after spending almost 2 years doing weekend after weekend, hours upon hours of bar and bat mitzvah services, I had about had it. I began openly defying the Jewish Studies department, arguing that this whole thing was ridiculous. In Hebrew classes, I complained that Hebrew was a functionally useless language and that we should be learning Chinese instead. I remember a Jewish Studies teacher opening dialogue with me, and when I told him that the laws and the things that happened in the Torah were really messed up, he agreed with me. I asked why even follow this religion if it says things like to kill witches, to which he replied, it also says to kill homosexuals. This wasn't like an I hate gay people and I'm going to kill them type thing, just for clarification, but it was beyond me why this man would admit that these things are awful and still dedicate his life to following the book. I left that conversation without learning anything useful. The Jewish Studies classes themselves transformed into 3 different sections. A class dedicated to biblical something or other, a class dedicated to Jewish identity, and a class dedicated to Zionism. The Zionism class was my favorite, less because we discussed things like the Israeli Air Force decimating Egyptian aircraft on the ground in the opening hours of the Six-Day War, but more because it was a Jewish Studies class that wasn't actually centered around religion. I don't care about the spies sent to Canaan or whatever. I don't care about Kabbalah. I don't care about any of this Judaism bullshit. I want funky political history. I want to listen to an extremely biased view of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict that doesn't even mention the Palestinian exodus or occupation of the West Bank. But it's okay and totally balanced because they said the King David hotel bombing was bad but had good intentions. I want to uncontrollably laugh as half the class fails a true-false Kahoot question about the United Nations we had been talking about for basically the entire semester. But at the end of the day, Jewish Studies and Tefillah and lunch prayers and Kippot still haunted me. At least now, I would sneak a Kindle into my Siddur when they brought my grade together to pray, and I would read something I actually enjoyed. I'm sure some of the teachers noticed, but they would let me be. We'll call the head of the Jewish Studies department Miss G. To introduce Miss G, one Shabbat lunch I was unable to eat the meal they provided due to my gluten restriction. Fortunately, I had a snack in my backpack, some pirate's booty which I ate to hold me over. But the meal they provided was a meat dish, and pirate's booty was dairy. That's a no-no in kosher law. She chastised me for eating some of the only food I could eat there because everyone else was eating meat. I had tried to find something else first, asked the kitchen, but there was nothing. Thus began my personal grudge with Miss G. Our 8th grade Shabbaton was joined by visiting Israeli students from Kiryat Gat. Our first night at the camp, they made an agree-disagree line in the gymnasium and read out statements. Much to my surprise, when the teacher read out the statement, "I believe in God," Most of the Israeli students stood by me on the disagree line, while most of my other classmates were somewhere in between or on the agree line. That was new to me. The people from the Holy Land, the land promised to our forefathers, the land fought for by our Jewish siblings around the world, were less religious than my grade and my school. Whack. The next day during Shabbat services, my friend Dee and I were doing some quiet chatting because, once again, we've done this 100 times and it means nothing to us. Dee coughs. Miss G drags us outside and yells at us, screaming about disrespect, that the Israeli students are here, that our actions were an affront to God and Judaism. She argues that if we hated religion so much, then we wouldn't be allowed to go on Tiyul, because Tiyul was a religious trip. This was after I learned that a decent chunk of Israelis are, in fact, not religious, so the prospect of the trip I'd been waiting 10 years for, the focal point of my time at this school, and the last experience I wanted to milk out of this environment was at risk, devastated me. After Miss G left, I broke down in tears, and Dee comforted me for some time before heading back inside. I found a spot in the snow behind the building, sat down, and cried. My 8th grade literature teacher, one of my favorite teachers in the school, later found me and consoled me. Dee never went to Israel. At a meetup among some friends over 5 years after we left the Jewish school, he explained that Miss G barred him from going. I don't know if something else was going on with him or what, but for whatever reason, I was allowed to go and he wasn't. The rest of 8th grade was pretty good. Our history class skipped from a month of the French Revolution all the way to the Holocaust for the rest of the year. We really learned about the concept of the other, and I think I have a good shot at spotting if I'm about to be the victim of a genocide now. In our literature class, we read Night by Elie Wiesel. That book briefly exposed me to the idea of the death of God being a concept in Jewish philosophy, especially following the Holocaust. It's a good book, and I would highly recommend it. We also actually had some comprehensive sex education for a few days, so that was nice. It was more basic stuff like how to put on a condom, and they only mentioned safe practices for heterosexual activities, but it was still better than most other religious schools in the U.S. During that homeroom class, I would stop reciting the Pledge of Allegiance and just enjoyed the music when it came time for Hatikvah. Now that I was paying attention, the divides between the Jewish Studies department and the rest of the school were becoming much more apparent. Years later, my brother would comment about how his science teacher had an argument in class with a Jewish Studies teacher, I think the same storytelling one, after the Jewish Studies teacher dismissed evolution as just a theory. Honestly, the school I went to was really good and offered a very high-quality education, but one that was constantly marred by the omnipresence of the Jewish Studies department. If that hour and a half of Jewish studies every day was allocated towards more useful educational needs, such as programming classes, I might have actually enjoyed and excelled in the school. We had a yearly operetta at the Jewish school. I didn't like to be on stage much, so I purposefully flopped my audition, got a role as an extra in one scene, and then chilled in the back of our cafeteria working on the light crew for the rest of the musical. Of course, just doing a regular rendition of Cinderella wasn't enough. Cinderella goes on to have a Jewish wedding with Prince Charming, and they kiss under a chuppah. Then every member of the cast bows and proceeds to sit on stage and sing some song in Hebrew. The Sunday school was getting better too. In our last year, we no longer solved puzzles and talked about some religious whatever while eating chips. Instead, we had some actual speakers, and interesting ones at that. The sister of a woman who was murdered with her husband in cold blood, and how she came to forgive the killer. A former crack addict, and how converting to Catholicism saved her from her addiction. And near the end of it all, after 10 years of growing up in this environment, the ups, the downs, the goods, the bads, the fun times and the boring times, our class packed our bags and prepared to go to Israel. Our connecting flight was in New York. Our class was lined up among a sea of Haredim, people my teachers referred to as black hats, waiting to get through a passport check. A police MRAP waited outside. When I made it to the passport check, they asked me a variety of questions, including what synagogue I went to. I said I did not go to synagogue, but my family's Catholic church was such and such. They held me back for like a minute longer than the rest of my classmates with more questions. When we got on the El Al flight, we were still surrounded by Haredim. A Haredi boy ran up to one of my classmates and asked her name, which was a biblical one. When she said it, the boy said, "You're not holy enough for that name." Already off to a good start. I spent the plane ride using the seatback monitor to play chess and watched American Sniper and The Imitation Game. By the time we arrived at Ben Gurion International Airport, I was jet-lagged as hell. The first thing we did was go to a museum dedicated to some rebellion or something, but I just went outside and slept on the grass for an hour or two. That seemed to fix everything somehow. My experience in Israel is a jumbled timeline. Some things here will definitely be out of order. I don't remember it all. I can't even access the SD card that I think has the pictures I took from the trip, but I still have plenty of memories. Our group had 2 armed security guards with us, both Israeli. One claimed to have been a sniper in the army and showed us a scar on his shoulder he said was from a bullet wound, although I can't confirm he wasn't just messing with us. We went south to the Negev, hiked through the desert, rode some camels courtesy of some local Bedouins, and camped in tents. Under the cloudy night skies in the middle of the desert, my classmates discussed how they were going to miss the school, and how they couldn't believe things were almost over. To me, the end of school couldn't come soon enough. We went to Kiryat Gat and visited the students who came to us earlier in the year for the Shabbaton. With the student a friend and I were assigned to stay with, we played a makeshift version of American football in the middle of the night and went back to our host family's house to watch the Avengers, shower, and get some rest. If a rocket alarm sounded, we had about 45 seconds to get to shelter before impact. The whole time I was around these Israeli kids my age, the main thought on my mind was that these people would be in the army in 4 years. Their teachers gave us a Tanakh labeled with the coat of arms of the city. Separating from the Kiryat Gat students, we walked through more desert, past ancient structures under cliffs, and at the end of it all, we inched our way down a cliff ourselves. We went to a hostel where one of my classmates, a more jockey-type kid who wrote that he was African-American on a test once because his dad owns a house in South Africa, claimed he had $100 worth of shekalim that was stolen. Miss G claimed that everyone on the bus he was on would not get to go to Masada or the Dead Sea unless the thief returned the money. The whole class basically knew he lost it, and in the morning we planned to band together and just give this guy $100 on the off chance that Miss G wasn't bluffing. Come morning, of course, she was bluffing, and everyone hated her just a little bit more. We hiked up Masada in the early morning to see the sunrise, but it was cloudy. We went to the Dead Sea and floated around for a bit, but it wasn't as floaty as I originally imagined. Finally, we moved on to Yerushalayim, the capital of Israel, home of ancient history and holy sites. I still fairly vividly remember exiting a tunnel and seeing the city skyline with the Dome of the Rock appear for the first time. The teachers specifically put on for when we finally saw it. It was a really beautiful sight. We stayed in Jerusalem for a few days, and during Yom HaAtzmaut, celebrations in the street led to massive silly string battles, my friends and I using each other as human shields while blasting at a pair of Israeli kids shooting at us with silly string while shouting, "Fuck you, Americans!" Eventually, the street turned into enough of a chaotic silly string mess that the police started confiscating any silly string they saw. We visited marketplaces. The teachers brought us to some old war trenches and had us play a version of tag in them. We visited Yad Vashem. During Shabbat in Jerusalem, our class was split into groups that would go to synagogues of different denominations for Shabbat services. I was assigned to go to an Orthodox synagogue, and none of my friends were in the group. I dreaded the hours of boredom up until we found out that the synagogue was closed that day. Instead, we sat on the grass of a nearby park and talked and enjoyed the sun. Later, we headed to the Kotel, the Western Wall, the holiest site in Judaism. This is where, back in kindergarten, we wrote prayers on slips of paper to be put in the cracks of the wall. The teachers had us cover our eyes for a big reveal, and then when the blindfold came off, we were on a balcony a block away, and the wall was pretty underwhelming. Eventually we got closer, I touched it, and I thought about how crazy it would be if I had some amazing experience of religious rejuvenation. Instead, I was most interested in the layers. The wall showed an amazing history of thousands of years of building on top of the previous wall. That was all. It also revealed some serious sexism. The men's side of the wall was at least 3 times larger than the women's side. Back at the hotel, it was still Shabbat. That means no turning on the TV or using any other electronics. My friends and I obviously didn't care and ended up watching some kind of murder mystery about some kid with DID going around murdering people at a motel or something. In the hotel hallway, my other classmates were talking or playing cards. Eventually, we decided to call it a night. We woke up to a teacher knocking on our door and ordering us to clean up the mess in the hallway. Our classmates had trashed it. We said we were asleep, literally in our pajamas, but they had us clean up the hall anyways. The kids who actually trashed the place didn't do much to help. After the auction thing, Miss G's bus bluff, and now this Jerusalem hotel hallway, it was pretty clear that the teachers here love to use collective punishment, usually to me and my friends' expense. We moved on, visiting the Lebanese border. Our tour guide pointed out a UN watchtower and said, "United Nations, more like United Nothing," which I only remember because it sounded so stupid. We drove into some kind of military facility and saw military vehicles out of our bus window, including I think some Merkavas. They were there at the border in case of an invasion. Moving on, we went to a kibbutz, what was left over from the Jewish communes at the first Aliyahs, and saw the community. Most kibbutzim are privatized now, but the communities themselves still exist. We went into a bunker on the kibbutz, designed to protect the border community. The tour guide said that the bunker had numerous secret rooms to better hide, shelter, and supply the people of the kibbutz if there was a more successful repeat of the Yom Kippur War that put the lives of Israeli Jews at risk. We also made some chocolate. We stayed for another Shabbat by the hills surrounding the Sea of Galilee. It was a nice hostel, and we hiked up the hills and sat watching the sea in the sun. The teachers made the mistake of rooming the two closeted kids together, which led to some moments of discovery and repressed memories that helped me realize my bisexuality 3 years later. We rode to the Jordan River, and two kids making out in the back of the bus caused the teachers to declare the buses gender segregated in the name of switching things up a bit. We rafted down the river, jumping in the water and racing each other. On the ride back to our buses, a Haredi man on his phone briefly looked up at us, said fucking shit, and then went back to talking on his phone. We went to Haifa and saw Akko prison. We were at a gas station in between cities when the Yom HaShoah siren sounded. The country by and large came to a stop to commemorate the victims of the Holocaust. My classmates continued talking and eating chips as if nothing was happening. We went to Tel Aviv and saw the site that Israel declared independence at. We rode bikes across a seafront path. We saw where Yitzhak Rabin was shot and killed. We went to a marketplace where we saw t-shirt stands selling pornographic t-shirts and one of the funniest shirt designs I've ever seen. I'm still peeved I didn't get it. At the end of it all, our teachers gave us 2 souvenirs. A siddur with an inside label commemorating the trip and our name in Hebrew and English, and a rock from Israel with our names etched onto it. We boarded the plane home, this time with a lot less Haredim, and returned to the United States. Once we were back in America and had access to our phones, we pretty much immediately Googled the same thing. While we were partying in Jerusalem, there was one rocket fired out of the Gaza Strip in the direction of Sderot, but it landed in a field, harming no one. There were also multiple IED attacks against Israeli checkpoints in the West Bank. If the conscription and guards and bunkers and rockets and tanks weren't enough of a hint, Israel is a highly militarized country. We would see soldiers walking around regularly, and even occasionally people in plainclothes with rifles. Terrorism was a regular occurrence, and the country was still surrounded by enemies. When I returned from Israel, I had exhausted the last thing I wanted from this Jewish school. I was done. I was done with Sunday school, too. My high school choice was selected, and I was ready to move on to the next chapter in my life. Graduation was smooth. We stood for photos outside our synagogue when a shirtless guy on a bike rode by shouting, "Jesus Christ is our Lord and Savior, you guys killed Jesus," to which one of my classmates replied, "That we did," to a chorus of laughter. One last bout of anti-Semitism before going on our merry way. Throughout the 8th grade, we prepared for and took entrance exams to high school. Some were high-quality public schools that you had to test to get into. Others were private schools. The 2 private schools I looked at were a secular and a Catholic school. I shadowed at both. I knew the Catholic school wasn't for me when I said fuck, and the guy I was shadowing was like, "We don't say that here." I try to imagine a cursed version of me in the timeline where I went to Catholic school right after 10 years of that bullshit. I knew the secular private school wasn't for me when they threw me in a higher division math class and said, "Don't worry if you don't get it," and it was stuff I had already worked through in my middle school math classes. At the end of the day, I ended up choosing between 2 public schools, both the best schools in the city. One was within walking distance and had better funding due to wealthier parents having their kids attend. The other was an hour and a half away by public transit and had a more modest budget. In an effort to get away from the snobby wealth and the other kids in my grade, I chose to go to the faraway school and move away from everything I hated about the Jewish school. About half my classmates went private, many to schools known to cater to wealthy families and the upper class of society. The other half went public and more or less turned out better adjusted, I think. There were still some incidents I heard about through the grapevine, like a racist group chat leak that caught some of my former bullies in a public school, and now no one really wanted to be friends with them, which all seemed to confirm my disdain for the place I came from. I ended up the only person from my grade to attend the high school I was going to, and I think that was all for the best. I was in a new environment, and everyone I met was new, and I had just come out of 10 years of schooling with a grade of the same 50 people who were all upper to upper middle class, mostly white Jews. This school's grade size was 5 times larger. I no longer knew everyone's first and last names, nor did I have opinions on each of them. It was hard, don't get me wrong. I was an introvert in a new, diverse environment. For the first couple months, I sat alone at lunch and didn't really have many friends. Atheism was still one of my defining traits, but once I realized that no one actually cared anymore and I no longer had Judaism breathing down my neck, I was free to put it on the back burner. The pile of kippot had disappeared. I had classes that interested me and didn't waste an hour and a half a day learning a near-useless language and studying a single millennia-old book. Classes were more challenging, and while I was among the top of my class at the Jewish school, I was just average here. The first time I got a bad grade was a bit of a shock, but it did help teach me that I was nothing special. I made new friends from all over, some Jews, most not. I was exposed to people who were actually poor, like families below the poverty line poor, and the ideas from my childhood that I hadn't yet deconstructed continued to chip away. I sat with Christians, Muslims, Hindus, atheists, a diverse selection of people I couldn't have dreamed about before. And after a few months, the culture shock faded, and I more or less settled into secular public school life. I was never totally disconnected. When applying for high school concert band in freshman year, I auditioned with my memorized alto saxophone version of Hatikva. Once a classmate came up to me with a picture of some kind of sign and asked me if it was Hebrew. In my Mandarin course, yes, I did keep my word that I'd rather learn Chinese, I would sometimes joke around by writing Hebrew on the chalkboard. At the school's annual club fair, I would internally laugh my ass off every time they placed the Jewish Student Union and Students for Justice for Palestine at the same table. I had an Orthodox Jewish computer science teacher who, upon finding out I was a Jew, tried to pressure me into celebrating Passover, which, in a public school, I think might have been illegal. I carried shekalim from Tiyul in my backpack, where they remain to this day. That got my last name the nickname Shekels. It's not anti-Semitic in nature, I swear. And at least some of my friends, if they are watching, will know about the infamous Purim-themed Gangnam-style video the school synagogue released. I still went to the Sunday school, but this time as a volunteer in order to rack up the service hours I needed for high school graduation. My parents were going to drag me there anyways. My brother was still in attendance despite being as openly atheist as me. I ended up making the best of it and, after volunteering, spent an hour making $20 a class off of teaching kids preparing for their B'nai Mitzvot how to read Hebrew. I remember soon after I left the Jewish school, I was playing a game of CSGO casual when someone in the voice chat started saying, "For real, fuck Israel." I didn't respond, but part of me had this knee-jerk reaction to defend Israel. I started trying to learn more, no longer burdened by severe bias, and ended up down a near-endless rabbit hole of history, conflict, modern politics, and things I still can't wrap my head around. My thoughts on Israel became inconclusive, although I generally think a two-state solution is the most feasible. Throughout high school, I had a writing tutor. He was Catholic, gay, and a former teacher at my Jewish school. We laughed often about the bullshit that happened there. He told me how during Valentine's Day he would give out heart candies, which caused Miss G to berate him because Valentine's Day wasn't something Jewish, cultural holidays be damned. He also told me how he brought his boyfriend to a staff dinner at the school once, and you would never be able to guess who got upset at that. As I went through high school, explored my identity after Judaism, discovered my queerness and more of myself, and moved on to college, I think I finally might have left it all behind. Recovered, healed, done with it. I would explain my background to people occasionally, and in college with a state without as many Jews, there were many people who hadn't really spoken to a Jew before. And yet I moved on, and my family moved on too. We no longer go to Mass on Christmas Eve and Easter. We no longer have Seders and light the Hanukkah. My parents swear around me now, and my mom shouts, "God damn it." My parents didn't even blink when I told my staunch Zionist grandparents that the Palestinian people exist and have as much right to an independent state as the Jews do. Those 10 years were part of my backstory, my lore, and I had finally closed that last chapter I left just half a decade ago. Ha! You thought it would be that easy. A couple years into college and I get this crazy idea. It's Hanukkah, let's get a free meal. A friend and I go to our university's Hillel. He has some Jewish ancestry but doesn't know diddly squat about Judaism. I pop up and they're spinning dreidels on their handles and knowing all the prayers even after years of not hearing them. We grab some latkes and some Asian food. Some older guy comes around and asks where we were from. I told him where I went to school and he was like, "Oh yeah, I know that place," because of course he does. All old religious Jewish people know of every synagogue or temple in existence. It's uncanny. We eat our noodles and latkes and sufganiyot and head home. Over winter break, I'm walking home from skiing up in Alaska. There are people staying at our neighbor's house across the street. A group of late teens, early 20s boys are throwing snowballs at each other and beckon me to join. While throwing them, they shout things like 6-Day War and other slogans clearly indicating they are quite familiar with Israel. When they ask me my name, I give them my dead name. I didn't know how religious they were, and I didn't want to risk anything. My family went across the street to visit them for dinner, and we played some card games where they found out I was Jewish too. It didn't really change much, besides a, "Why didn't you tell us you were Jewish?" They were part of a Jewish college group from Florida that was led by a man who was a family friend of our neighbors. This guy was likewise older and absurdly familiar with the Jewish community. One of the younger guys there asked the older guy if he'd do his wedding. The older guy replied, "Only if it's a woman," and I'm glad I didn't out myself to them. And yet, despite the continued experiences, good or bad, it never leaves you. Some days you don't think about it, but others it rests on your mind for a while. One day you open up Duolingo and add the Hebrew language module with the excuse, "Might as well maintain it." 10 years does not leave easily. The state of Israel considers me a Jew. Some Orthodox Jews would consider me a Jew, others not even after all of that because my father is Jewish instead of my mother. Nazi Germany would have considered me a Jew. I do not believe in God. I do not associate with the Jewish community much besides a single, small, politically oriented Discord server. I'm still a Jew. I have been considering myself more of a Jew with time. I still find Judaism boring and problematic, and I definitely still find Israel problematic. If I have children, I want to pass this on to them. If I have children, I don't want them to go through what I have. At the very least, infant circumcision is off the table. Untangling Jewishness from Judaism is a mess. Jewish culture largely revolves around religious traditions. How can I keep the parts that I like while separating myself from the parts that I don't? How can I have the get-together and good meal of a Seder without setting up some kind of religious ceremony? What's the point of lighting Hanukkah candles, and why is the back of my mind screaming for me to continue the tradition? I have no idea what the future of this part of my identity might hold. I have seen others with similar upbringings follow my path to become self-described Jewish atheists and abandon the religion and traditions entirely. I've seen others lean harder towards Zionism and volunteer for the IDF. I've seen others embrace the religion and go deeper into the works and stories I found unbearably dull. 10 years of a Jewish school, the people I was raised by, the people I was born to, any of these could have made me a Jew. I got a hat trick. I can't escape this identity no matter how much I try. Even if I didn't want to be a Jew, even if I never wanted to be a Jew, even if I threw out my entire identity and moved to another country and never spoke a word of Hebrew again, I would still be a Jew. I'm not immediately identifiable as Jewish. I have some parts of a stereotypical look, but the only hint that could really give me away is my blatantly Yiddish last name. And yet it's still something I am, and something I need to consider as anti-Semitism can still be relatively common. It's an inescapable fate by religion, ethnicity, and culture. You can minimize its impact, you can shrink it so small it becomes irrelevant, but it is always there. And as you leave it, there's a guilt. There aren't many Jews out there, and the Jewish population of the world only recently recovered from the Holocaust. There's the burden of the ethno-religion, that you have a line of ancestry leading to an ancient land with ancient traditions that have been passed down to you, and you just abandon them. The Orthodox computer science teacher in high school didn't mention that I should celebrate Passover because of something to do with God, but instead because I apparently had the responsibility to pass down the millennia-old torch of tradition. When I've spoken with my brother and dad and found out that I'm the only person in my family who can still read and write Hebrew, and the only one in my immediate family who has been to Israel, I find that, ironically, after so much opposition, the torch has been placed in my hand to pass on or extinguish. But those ancients are dead, and their customs are recorded in the history books. Some of those customs I've admittedly enjoyed, so I can try and pick them out and save the parts of their culture I want to keep. Jewish culture does not belong to the dead, but to the living, and as a Jew, I think I have every right to seize it and mold it to my liking. So maybe it's okay to embrace it and struggle with keeping the things you like and tossing the things you don't. Maybe it would be best to embrace the pointless rituals out of a sense of comfort rather than a sense of prayer. You don't say a prayer when you light up a Christmas tree. Why does a Hanukkah have to be any different? Cook holiday foods out of season. Learn that useless language. Remember that your Hebrew name was never changed when you transitioned, and change it. Argue about Israel because while your familiarity with the country is foreign at best, you can still sing Hatikva from memory almost a decade later. You come back to the Jewish school a couple times. The first time is to talk with a class of 8th graders about your high school, and when you enter, the hallways seem absurdly small. You tell them how much you preferred high school to the Jewish school. The math teacher supervising the kids mentions his husband. On the school's website, you see mentions of pride celebrations. The classrooms are marked with Progress Pride flag stickers saying safe space. You're happy for the kids there and jealous that support and education wasn't there for you at that age. You come back for a reunion with your old classmates. Many turned out for the better, and many still were going to infamous party schools for university. The school has a new wing, with rumors saying it was created after some payment dispute with the synagogue. Hebrew still lines the walls. That 8th grade literature teacher who comforted you is now principal of the middle school. A former Israeli prime minister visited the school in recent years. I wonder how the school will react if the current Israeli government manages to kill its democracy. You meet up with some old friends from the school and find out that most of them have also left Judaism, but the ties stick around. You discuss what happened at the school to make sure you aren't crazy and just looking at things with angst-tinted glasses. There's anxiety that you somehow gaslit yourself. With a sigh of relief and a reminder that what you all went through was real, you don't feel as much like you're lying to yourself about something when you relay the story. When you look back at old pictures of you in school, there's whiplash. Not just because you were a boy once, but because you have become so separated from your religious Jewish upbringing that it shocks you that you were once that kid in a kippah. And then maybe you start to care more about the Jewish communities and traditions you actively reject. You cringe harder than most people around you at active anti-Semitism. Some other Jews you speak to, from the U.S. or around the world, describe feeling a need to hide that part of themselves, and you almost feel glad you had a community that instead helped foster that identity, even if its methods were pretty shit. You learn about how much some American evangelicals love Jews, and how much American Jews hate evangelicals. You learn how some evangelicals appropriate elements of Jewish culture that Christians had previously suppressed, and you recall how much American Jews hate them for it. Why the hell are these people blowing the shofar at a church service? And you're not supposed to touch the Torah with your bare hands. You start to understand why American evangelicals love Israel and Jews so much, and you get offended as hell at it. You find the irony in the Jewish diaspora being more skeptical of Israel than dedicated Christians. You learn to be cautious in conservative spaces, more than you already are as a trans woman. They tend to only like the good Jews and have a tendency to cozy up with Nazis. You learn to be cautious in progressive spaces. The common disdain for Israel and support for anti-Zionism crosses the threshold of simple political criticism often. It can certainly make existing in queer groups a pain. And it was enough of a problem with one queer group I was involved with that they had to swap around the group's leadership. You think about returning to Israel, not doing Aliyah, fuck that, but seeing the country again with a fresh and matured pair of eyes. Maybe you'll give it a try when the country is under more stable and less genuinely awful leadership. You examine the audience and try to toe the line for a good Jew joke. New additions to the library come regularly. I mean, who wouldn't want to operate a space laser? You find a 14th century poem, one that speaks to your experience as being transgender with deep enough familiarity it brings you to tears, written in a language you are all too familiar with. You watch your mom talk about how you're still half Catholic when that part of your identity has been effectively purged in its entirety. Even if it was given more attention than just a First Communion and some Sunday school, it's not the same as being Jewish. You find yourself explaining that Jews are an ethno-religious group, not like Christianity or Islam. And yes, it actually is possible to be Jewish and an atheist, believe it or not. You find yourself wandering into a Jewish cemetery in a country without many Jews and muttering a V'it Gadol V'it Gadash Shemei Rabbah under your breath out of some sense of familiarity rather than purpose. You use the fact that you're the only Hebrew literate person in your family to your advantage when questioning your gender, writing gender experiments and notes and observations in a transliterated version of Hebrew cursive, such that your family, with a tendency to snoop around, can't decipher it easily. You watch Borat too, and notice that Sacha Baron Cohen isn't actually speaking Kazakh almost immediately. You appreciate the subtleties of certain characters in media that quietly indicate they're Jewish, even if it's just a name or the use of a Yiddish or Hebrew word. With everything I hated about Judaism, there are still some things I appreciated. There is no afterlife in Judaism, or at least not a focus on it. Judaism places an immense value on life, to the point that the Jewish toast word is l'chaim, meaning to life. You can break any of the mitzvot in Judaism to save a life. For example, if gender dysphoria is going to drive you to suicide, then transition. There's no need to beg for forgiveness or hate yourself, even if it's technically against Jewish law. It's okay. You saved a life, and that's more valuable than any religious decree. Judaism famously values questions and arguments, with the Talmud basically being a bunch of rabbis discussing and debating various topics. It's not too uncommon for a rabbi to be agnostic. Total faith is not a requirement in Judaism. Judaism allows me to hate it and still be considered a Jew. I don't think this is ever going to leave me, no matter what degree of embracing or rejecting I allow. I don't think it's trauma, despite my deep-seated distaste for the school and the religion. It's something that sticks, something that keeps bringing me back, something inescapable. I have no idea what I'm going to do with it. Toda Rabbah.